Rome did not fall in a single night. There was no final scream of civilization, no universal moment when the ancient world suddenly realized that everything it had built was over. No fire consumed all memory at once. No darkness swept across Europe like a curtain falling at the end of a play. Instead, the Roman Empire faded quietly, unevenly, and almost invisibly, while people continued to live their ordinary lives. Children were born, fields were cultivated, prayers were spoken, and laws were written in the same Latin that had governed the world for centuries. What we later chose to call the fall of Rome was not an ending in the way we imagine endings. It was a transformation so gradual that most of those living through it never understood that they were standing at the threshold of a new age. For generations, history has taught us to see Rome's fall as a catastrophe, a collapse that shattered civilization and plunged Europe into chaos and ignorance. This image is powerful and dramatic, but it is also deeply misleading. It reflects not the reality of late antiquity, but the fears and assumptions of later centuries that looked back at Rome as a lost golden age. When Renaissance scholars and Enlightenment thinkers searched for the roots of their own world, they saw Rome as order, reason, and greatness, and the centuries that followed as darkness. To make sense of that contrast, they needed Rome to fall completely. Yet history does not obey our need for clear endings. To understand what really happened, we must first understand what Rome truly was. Rome was not merely a city, nor even just an empire defined by borders and armies. It was a system, an immense complex structure of administration, law, infrastructure, economy, and identity. Roman roads connected distant provinces into a single network. Roman law standardized justice from Britain to North Africa. Roman citizenship created a shared political belonging that transcended language and ethnicity. A man born in Spain, Africa, or the Balkans could rise to the highest offices of the empire. Rome's power lay not only in conquest, but in its extraordinary ability to absorb, organize, and integrate. Yet systems of such scale are always fragile. They depend on balance between center and periphery, between taxation and productivity, between military force and civilian life. By the 3rd century, that balance was under severe strain. Civil wars erupted with increasing frequency, as emperors were proclaimed by armies and discarded just as quickly. Loyalty shifted away from the state toward individual commanders. Economic instability followed political chaos, as coinage was debased, inflation rose, and long-distance trade became more uncertain. None of this meant that Rome was collapsing, but it did mean that Rome was changing under pressure. The empire responded as it always had, by adapting. Power became more centralized, the emperor more absolute and distant. The old republican traditions, long weakened, faded into ceremony and symbolism. Administration became heavier, taxation more rigid, and society more tightly controlled. These reforms kept the empire functioning, but they also made it less flexible, less able to absorb new shocks. Rome survived by transforming itself, but each transformation came at a cost. One of the most profound changes within the Roman world was religious. For centuries, Roman religion had been pluralistic and pragmatic. Gods were honored as part of civic life, not personal faith. Christianity disrupted this model entirely. What began as a marginal and persecuted movement gradually became tolerated, then favored, and finally central to imperial identity. Authority was no longer merely political, it became moral and spiritual. Loyalty was owed not only to the emperor, but to a divine order that transcended the state. This shift would prove decisive, because when imperial power weakened, Christianity did not disappear with it.
Instead, it adapted, carrying Roman concepts of authority, law, and universality into a new age. At the same time, Rome's borders were changing in meaning. They were no longer simple lines separating civilization from barbarism. They became zones of constant interaction. Germanic peoples traded with Rome, served in its armies, settled within its territories, and adopted its customs. They learned Latin, converted to Christianity, and sought Roman titles and recognition. They did not see Rome as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a system to be joined. When large groups such as the Goths crossed into Roman lands, they did so not as conquerors driven by hatred, but as migrants seeking land, protection, and opportunity within a world they already understood and admired.
Rome's failure was not that it was invaded, but that it could no longer fully integrate those who depended on it. The system that had once absorbed millions now struggled to manage its own complexity. Authority fragmented, not because people rejected Rome, but because Rome could no longer sustain its former reach. The year 476 AD has become a symbol, a convenient date to mark the end of the Western Roman Empire. In that year, a Germanic officer named Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus. Yet to the people living in Italy at the time, this event was hardly the apocalypse later generations imagined. Odoacer did not abolish Roman institutions, he ruled through them. The Senate continued to meet, Roman law continued to be applied, and daily life continued much as before. The imperial insignia were sent to Constantinople, acknowledging that the empire still existed, just not with a Western emperor. This was not a collapse experienced by society, it was an administrative transition. As central imperial authority weakened in the West, power did not vanish, it localized. Large landowners, bishops, and military leaders took on roles once filled by imperial officials. Protection, justice, and governance became personal rather than bureaucratic. This shift was not chaos, but adaptation to new realities. Roman villas became centers of economic and social life. Loyalty became based on relationships rather than distant institutions. Over time, these arrangements evolved into the feudal structures of medieval Europe. They were not invented overnight, nor imposed by force, but emerged gradually from the remnants of Roman administration. Throughout this transformation, Roman culture did not disappear. Latin remained the language of law, learning, and religion. Roman legal principles continued to shape ideas of justice and authority. Most importantly, the Church became the primary guardian of Roman continuity. Bishops replaced governors as local leaders. Monasteries preserved literacy and texts that would otherwise have been lost. Church institutions maintained networks of communication and shared identity across fragmented political landscapes. In many ways, the Church became Rome's heir, not inheriting its armies, but its vision of universal order. While Western Europe fragmented into new kingdoms, the Eastern Roman Empire endured. Centered in Constantinople, it preserved Roman law, administration, and imperial ideology for nearly 1,000 years. Its people called themselves Romans. Its emperors ruled as Roman emperors. Roman identity did not vanish, it evolved, shaped by Greek language and Christian theology, but rooted in the same imperial tradition. Rome had not fallen everywhere. It had simply transformed differently in different regions. From this long process of change emerged Europe as we recognize it. The political unity of empire gave way to a patchwork of kingdoms. Centralized bureaucracy was replaced by local authority. Pagan civic identity was replaced by Christian cultural unity. Roman traditions blended with Germanic customs, creating new forms of governance, warfare, and social organization. This was not a step backward into darkness, but a reorganization of society under new conditions.
The lesson of Rome's fall is not that civilizations end suddenly in ruin. It is that they transform, often quietly, while people continue to live their lives. What later generations call collapse is usually change viewed through the lens of nostalgia. Rome did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was too complex to remain unchanged. Its legacy did not vanish. It dispersed, adapted, and endured in new forms. Rome lives on in our laws, in our cities, in our ideas of citizenship and governance. It lives in the very structure of Europe itself. Rome's empire did not end. It became something else. And history did not stop with its transformation. It simply turned the page, while most people were too busy living to notice.